This one's going to be a little different than the others because I think everyone else was talking about really useful topics. Fear, fire-eating robots, life-saving things. But I don't do any of that, so I'm going to talk about what I do. How I got here, I'll split it up by decades to make it quick. 60s, little kid. Technology in my life was space food sticks and Tang. If the astronauts did it, it was cool. Anyone under 50 didn't get that joke. 70s, super busy being a drug addict. So if there was technology around, I would be incapable of working it. It's unfortunate I had a driver's license. But luckily, I cleaned up at the end of that decade and have been clean ever since, which helps me operate a motor vehicle much better now. 80s, I played in bands. I was a little punk rock, Minneapolis punk rock kid, and had a lot of fun, but I didn't even come close to making a living in music. In the 90s, I got a lucky break. I was playing in a club, and a producer heard my band and came and gave me the pep talk that said, "You're not very good, and your band's even worse. But if you wrote songs and had someone younger and more talented than yourself singing them, you could really go far." And I was like, thank you? But smart guy, turned out to be right, and I spent the 90s writing songs for other people and made a living at it, and it was really fun. But I still didn't have much to do with technology. At the end of the 90s, I branched out into engineering, mixing, and actually being a record producer, not only for other artists, but for film and TV. And that's when I began to grapple with this challenge of technology versus emotion in the studio, because right at this time that I moved into this part of the field was when digital technology was replacing analog technology. And there's this constant, semi-unnecessary debate, I think, going on that like a lot of guys my age are sitting around going, I miss tape, you know, and digital technology is ruining music and all this kind of stuff, which is just that kind of nostalgia. I can't afford it myself. It's the same kind of attitude that people my age go, well, music was better back in my day. And it's like, what's the last time you listened to a new band? You know what I mean? Everyone thinks the golden age of music was when they were 14 to 22. Do you ever notice that? Some guy the other day was talking about the golden age of music, and he meant like the 90s, and I'm like, what? Because that's when he was in college, all right? And so it's all through the lens of the beholder. But I think a good example of this is the controversy surrounding Autotune. Autotune is the devil. Autotune is ruining music. Autotune means nobody has to sing anymore. But a lot of times when I use Autotune, it's because I'm recording a very soulful singer, and they'll give me 4 passes at the vocal, and I have to comp it together. And supposing there's one line that a singer sings with great emotion, and you'll never get again because it's just their voice broke in the right place, but it's out of tune. Well, I can tune that. So there's a case of technology serving emotion. Now, that doesn't mean, that I don't want to listen to the radio with T-Pain and Cher on a nonstop rotation, although I do love Cher. That's not a joke. You don't love Cher? Whatever. Anyway, there's other examples. I don't like to vilify technology because if you think about the greatest bluesman of all time, in my opinion, Muddy Waters, moved off the plantation and to Chicago to make his living in music, and what's the first thing Muddy Waters did? He bought an electric guitar, which at that time was the cutting edge of music technology, because he wanted to get his music and his emotions over. So there's a lot of people that like to stand themselves up at the gate and say, this is blues, but that's not blues, or this is jazz, but that's not jazz. And I just don't have time for that kind of rule-making, including with this argument between, emotion and technology. There's a way that they can work together really, really well in music and art and life. If you think about it in the right way. I think in the recording studio, I read this article once, and I can't remember the title of it. It was something like The Myth of a Million Choices or something. And the writer was talking about the myth that more choices leads to better decisions. And I definitely disagree with that. A lot of people I know don't listen to music anymore because they say there's too much out there. It's just too much. They don't have time, or they're too scared to sit there and sort through things. I guess it's kind of like being in a greenhouse full of beautiful orchids if someone says, what's the prettiest flower? And you don't know because there's this myriad of beauty that you're just drowning in. Well, I think in the recording studio, I don't think that technology is the enemy, but I do think the way it's used can be counterproductive. One thing I've noticed, the difference between the old days studio and recording on tape and nowadays, is that the bands used to come in the old days, and a recording session was more like an audition back then. It was a big deal because it was expensive, because in order to make a record, you had to go somewhere that had a 24-track tape machine, super expensive. The band would rehearse really hard. They'd get their guitars worked on so they were set up perfectly, and the amps were working perfectly with new tubes, and the drummer would have new heads, and they'd show up, and they were excited, and they'd do like 4 takes of the song, and they'd look at you through the glass and go, "Did we get it?" It was a big deal. It was a big moment. Now, a lot of times, half the band shows up, "Oh, but Ralphie, our drummer, couldn't make it because he ended up having to work tonight at Pizza Hut." And half of them know the song and half of them don't know the song because a recording session is not a big deal. It's just going to Bobby's house down the street who has a laptop and some GarageBand on it. And I'm not dissing that. I'm just saying that it's not special anymore. And so in this situation, I've had bands show up and they kind of know the material but kind of not. And they give you 10 takes, each of which has hopefully moments of quality in it. And at the end of the 10th take, they don't look at you and say, "Did we get it?" They say, "You got enough?" That's the difference. I don't think technology is the villain here. I think it's people knowing. I'm dealing with acrobats now who have never worked without a net. Imagine the commitment of an acrobat who's never worked with a net. Now, those are people who are not going to fall, because if you fall, you die. All right? Those are the acrobats I want to work with. And they're still around. But we can't be led by technology. I think the point that I'm coming to is that technology should be a way to help us convey emotion better. There are some exceptions to this because there's some music that's not really about emotion per se, that celebrates its roboticness, Kraftwerk or some EDM or something like that, and that's a different thing. That's cool, and I like that stuff. But I think you could still make an Aretha Franklin record today, but not by sitting there and focusing on, oh, we're going to have Aretha, have the singer sing on 10 different microphones, and then you're finally pick your best microphone on her voice. By then, she's too tired to sing well. I've seen some engineers where they want to put the microphone, I'm exaggerating a little bit to make a point, they want to put the microphone right in the middle of the snare drum, and the drummer's like playing around the microphone, it's making him play not well, and the engineer's like, no, but that's where it sounds the best. And all you're doing then is making sure that you take a perfect picture of something really stupid and ugly. You know what I mean? So I think it's really easy to get turned around to this philosophical disadvantage where you're kind of like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Probably not the biggest problem you're facing if you're on the Titanic. If everyone in the studio is feeling good and playing well, then the technology should be kind of invisible underneath all that. Because if they're not feeling good and singing well and playing well and comfortable and happy, and you're, as a record producer, if you're not paying attention to that and you're just paying attention to the engineering, I think you're missing the whole point. So it's really important that they're happy, because in the end, there's only 2 things that make a hit record, and almost any producer will tell you the same thing. The first is the songwriting. There's only 4 things in a song: lyric, melody, harmony, beat. That job's already done usually by the time I get into the studio. And the second thing is the vocal. So the first thing is the story, and the second thing is the voice telling it. All right? Nobody ever, I'm going to buy Brad Paisley's new album because the snare drum is so well recorded. Said no one ever, and they never will. But some people spend 90% of their time in the studio focusing on that one thing, deck chairs. So I think the point I'm trying to make here is that emotion and technology, at least in my world, in the recording studio, can live together really, really well as long as emotion is leading the way and technology is a way to bring it out. Thank you.